All right. Welcome to Liberal Discourses, where we examine topics that may not be getting enough attention. Tonight we begin, pardon my language, good heavens. Tonight we begin part 2 of our three-part discussion on Lament for a Nation, the defeat of Canadian nationalism, written by George Grant in 1965. Grant was a Canadian philosopher, a university professor, and social critic. In Lament for a Nation, he deplored what he claimed was Canada's inevitable cultural absorption by the United States. His essay was a eulogy for Canadian nationalism. Grant was disillusioned with the political events of the early 1960s, liberalism and American hegemony. His prophetic tone stemmed from a belief that Canadians were complicit in prioritizing economic integration with the USA over independence. In the late 1950s, Canada awoke to the realization that it was being economically and culturally absorbed by the United States. Canadians began looking for ways to deal with the challenge of defining and defending a distinct national culture that would serve as the basis of a unique Canadian identity. And in that discussion, I am joined by Right Wing Nuck, a Spaces contributor and paleocon, who I've been having conversations with on metaphysical drivers in society that used to be well understood. Our outlooks are a bit different, and I tend more towards the practical end of political and economic points that Grant is talking about, whereas right wing is more attracted to the philosophical and metaphysical. But as we go through these aspects that are mentioned in A Lament for a Nation, I think we should be able to cover a fair bit of territory and you know some explore how we're different. So thank you so much for joining me, Right Wing. How are you doing this evening?
Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm looking forward to our discussion today. We were able to outline, I think, pretty well in episode one, defining terms, and today, hopefully, we'll be able to. I think we're going to get into the technical aspects of more of the history. If Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. It was eh, for people who didn't get a chance to listen to the last space, in our previous one, episode 1, our first discussion, we touched on the issue of Quebec and the French, including the Durham Report, where there was the recommendation after the rebellions in 1837-38, that it was time to assimilate the French into Anglo-Canada. So that's, what's at the root of the culture concerns for Quebec. We also went over the issue of the media and how some of what we're seeing today playing out in politics seems to be eerily similar to what Grant describes in his book as what he describes of the political climate and how the media plays itself out even back then. So it was interesting to see that not much has changed in 60 years. And yes, we also defined nationalism and went over some of the history of where it came from and how it's used as a political tool to create a myth that's used to foster a sense of collective identity. So I think that's an excellent place to start for the last episode. But yes, today we're going to be looking at some other instances where history and current events are rhyming. So pipelines, diplomacy, the military, national security, and so on. So, but I have to ask, right wing, are you just as astonished as I am at this sense of deja vu? Because I'm getting the sense of deja vu when I read Lament for a Nation.
Yeah, I mean the parallels are all over the place, and it's some of the variables are different. They're obviously the context of the time, the interests were a little bit different, but the parallels and the core concepts are definitely written the same today, and it'd be interesting to see what George Grant would have to say about our climate in today's society.
Well, exactly. He was very much a conservative leaning fellow that comes through in his book quite clearly. He does spend a lot of time discussing how the liberal government of the day was very interested in pursuing its own interests, which would reconcile with the business community as well. They seem to fit together a little bit better. But ultimately, the book is about a sense of nationalism and the loss of that and the Canadian identity. So I suppose my first question really to you has to be, do you think the issue of Canadian identity helps or hinders Canada when it comes to issues of resources and national security?
I think it's a double-edged sword, and I think we can see that due to the fact that Canada, we don't really have the. Not only do we not have the will, but we don't have the financial resources to really um, to to go in a new direction from the machine that we've been plugged into for so many generations now. So I think that's the main factor, and it's definitely polarizing, especially in the current climate of today. Even defining what a Canadian is can be seen as difficult. So any type of mobilizing to for um, any new desires is obviously going to be difficult.
Well, especially when it comes to the financing, I notice that this seems to be a common recurring theme, both in the politics that George Grant is mentioning in his book, and of course, what we're seeing today. For instance, when you look at the current issues of the pipelines out in Alberta, where Daniel Smith and Prime Minister Mark Carney signed a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, in order to contemplate doing pipeline expansion out to the West Coast in order to move more oil and gas products for international trade. A memorandum of understanding is not the same thing as an actual concrete agreement. And there have been discussions about how the Liberals could use, under the auspices of being in the national interest, could actually push that through if they wanted to. And there doesn't seem any inclination towards that. What are your thoughts on that? Right.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to see because there is this effort to push against Trump in America, and there have been there obviously the proposed Trans Mountain expansion and the Enbridge mainline upgrades, but are we going to really see work there? Are we going, or is it going to be hamstrung through different social elements that are within the liberal cause in Canada? And that's really the question. I think yeah, it's going to be uphill for anything to really be cohesive.
Well, what I found particularly interesting in the book that is that Grant talks about the Trans Canada Pipeline, which is now part of TC Energy, but it was a defining political crisis back in the 1950s. What had happened was Ontario and Montreal, Eastern Canada, basically had faced shortages of natural gas, and Alberta, it was discovered, had a surplus of natural gas after major discoveries. So, under Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent, his minister there of everything, as they called him, C.D. Howe, saw that there would be an opportunity for an all Canadian pipeline to bring natural gas from Alberta across the prairies and into Ontario and Montreal. And he saw it as a nation building project, kind of akin to the Canadian Pacific Railway. And what happened was there was, I suppose, a discussion with a consortium that had heavy US investment at the time. And so there were concerns about American involvement, whether or not this was going to be, you know, threatening, I guess, to our natural resource, especially when you're talking about infrastructure that really is important for Canadians. They had worked out an agreement, though, that primarily the majority of what was going through that pipeline to Eastern Canada was going to be for Canadians and not very much was going to be taken off for the Americans. But w- when it comes to how that actually got built, of course, do you know the story about that?
No, enlighten me. Hello.
Yeah, yeah. So there were agreements. They it had taken. There were actually multiple companies that had wanted to put this pipeline in. In fact, this had been in the works for some time, but they finally got the agreement sorted out. TransCanada had secured contractors, pipe supplies, and was ready to start construction on the western leg starting in 1956, but they were unable to finalize long-term private financing. So, in order to prevent a delay or possible cancellation of the entire project, the government agreed to provide temporary loans so the company could meet its contractual deadlines. So, it was a government-backed finance rescue for a privately owned but nationally important pipeline project. And we were looking at around about 80 to $118 million in loan guarantee. And in order to force a vote, CD Howe invoked closure, which is an end like time allocation, in order to force the vote through Parliament. And it was viewed as dictatorial, obviously, by the opposition, which would have been the progressive conservatives under John Beefingtaker at the time. There was a lot of talk about how they were selling out to Texas oil barons, risking taxpayer money for private and mostly American profit, violating parliamentary democracy. And the Liberal Party decided, nope, no compromise, and eventually to get passed. But it also ultimately wound up bringing down the Liberal government at the time because Diefenbaker and the Conservatives were able to capitalize on how it was handled ultimately. So when I look at what's going on with Alberta, the MOUs and the issues of additional pipelines and the reluctance of the Carney government to engage in forcing through a national project, despite the fact they have the powers, they seem reluctant to do so. I do have wonder if it's some awareness of history on how it turned out the last time around. And certainly there's been plenty enough talk about how they want to get into possibly an election again in order to secure a majority. So we shall see. For the time being, not conveniently or politically expedient, I'm thinking. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's also, I mean, if we look at it in today's lens, there's parallels to China specifically. I think it was this year that they there's talks of Chinese investment in a West Coast bitumen pipeline. There's a bunch of different um, bunch of different ways that the Chinese have infiltrated both the front and the back end of this, and I see this actually becoming a worse problem than even what we had back then, based on the complexity and the peril that our economy is in.
Well, that's just it. When you're talking about major infrastructure projects, I mean, your choices are burden the taxpayer, which is not ideal, or let industry come in and do their thing. And for some reason, we just can't seem to quite find a solution that's going to work for everybody. Let's put it that way. But I do, let's face it, the environment is also more challenging today than it was, say, back 60 or more so years ago. Today, we have Indigenous rights that need to be taken into consideration, more so probably than back then. Not saying it didn't have to happen, but it certainly has been impressed upon everybody now that that is a priority. And of course, you have your climate protests. There's also foreign funding of opposition to pipelines going in, so that would be environmental groups. So there, I mean, it makes the situation even more complex. Even if you had a company from outside that was saying, "Hey, I'm willing to invest," with all of these things, that it can be a bit of a roadblock. So I perhaps it's almost inevitable that these wind up turning into national projects at that point in time.
Yeah, it's just a matter of which master do you need to get it finished, and George Grant is continuously uh, echoes this with just being weary of imperial powers. And here, as we touched on in the first episode, we're kind of getting passed from being under America's spell to now the unknown, where it's China, it's Europe, it's really uncertain, which I don't know, for me at least, feels way worse. We're way worse off.
How much of that do you think is just being a middle power country versus our proximity to the United States and our history under the British Empire? Do you think it's some how do I put it? Lingering issues from the creation of our country that, might be hanging in there, or is it just and or a lack of vision of our politicians to see, uh, examples that were elsewhere in the world, like Norway or Sweden, and how they deal with their natural resources and economy, and perhaps not picking up on what could be beneficial. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of all of it. We've become accustomed to relying on America, and it's been good for us. We've been able to benefit from the economy there, from the markets, very quite easily. And up until recently, the relations were good, and I think because of that, the structure as originating as a colonial structure and then kind of evolving to what we're speaking about in the 60s here. It seems like we didn't really foresee where we needed to go, and it's kind of in the Canadian spirit that we are afraid of big changes, any kind of dramatic changes, and I think that has a part to do with it as well. We're kind of content and, dare I say, timid when it comes to anything of real risk, highly risk adverse. What do you think?
Well, it certainly seems to be the case, especially when it comes to the budget, but it there is a balance, of course, that we have to have as well. You can't take on major projects without spending money, and it's gotta come from somewhere, and the balancing act, of course, is that we've got to, be responsible to the voters as well. So, I mean, when I read through George Grant's book, and he's castigating the Liberals for the continentalism policies that they are undertaking, I understand where his frustration is as a conservative, and that you wanna be more traditional, for lack of a better way of putting it. You don't wanna have change, but at the same time, uh, it's coming to you whether you like it or not. And regardless of who's actually in the driver's seat, whether it's the Liberals or the Conservatives at that point in time, especially back in 1950s and 60s, you have an economy. Part of your job is to regulate trade, and you're gonna have to go out and find a way to get that done. And it may not necessarily fall within the parameters that you want, but, I mean, that's my thoughts. Um, what do you think? Is George Grant just a little too idealistic on this? Is he not looking at this more with a pragmatic lens and should be?
Yeah, well, that is the blatant disconnect here with his position, and we do see it over and over. The idealism of fighting the imperial force. It's really there's no practical imperative there, and I think that's the contradiction. I don't think it necessarily has to be that way, but and as we outline different things throughout the space today, there are glimmers where Diefenbaker's positions were you know virtuous in what he was trying to do to try to push back Kennedy and in all the positions that he was in from his conservative viewpoint, but or worldview, sorry. But I think ultimately the money, as we mentioned in the first space, the money has to be on board, and that's it. And if the money's not on board, there has to be at least some type of resource or some type of drive, and the will for sacrifice for the future that has to be ubiquitous. And if that's not there, then yeah, these contradictions shine bright.
Absolutely. Well, right after the um, Liberals lost their seat of government back in 1957 and Diefenbaker came in, one of the first things that he had to approve was the entry into NORAD, and that's, of course, the North American, defense initiative where you're looking after continental, North America, United States, Canada, because the Soviet threat was so big. Have you have you done a lot of? Do you know much about NORAD?
Yeah, NORAD was established in 57, 58 as an agreement to create a joint air defense to protect the continent from Soviet bomber and missile threats during the Cold War. Um, this was the first definitive turning point that was inevitable that George Grant points out as being almost a Faustian bargain. Canada really had no way out of this deal, and giving up whatever chance at future sovereignty there was to become this mechanism of military fusion where Canada becomes subordinate and essentially a command structure dominated by the U.S. On paper, Canada has a seat at the table for continental security, but Grant also points this out that this is just essentially a placeholder, and the final say gets boiled down to Washington's strategic needs and their timeline. And yeah, this in the book we're going to break this down later when it comes to a Beaumark missile crisis. There's a few places where this comes up. Now, from a practical standpoint, especially at the time because of the looming threat of the Soviets, the U.S. really pushed hard for Canada to host the nuclear-armed Beaumarks on its soil, despite Canadian sovereignty concerns and public opposition. But I think this was the best solution from the American defense requirements for the geopolitical balance that was the Cold War. And even though it wasn't in Canada's best interest, it's what we didn't really have a choice. Now, this development, arguably the most rational way to be able to protect the continent, is obviously Canada's military might. Sorry, the arguably the most rational way to be able to protect the continent, as obviously Canada's military might and wealth is inconsequential compared to America. Um, there's valid criticisms like NORAD's been renewed and expanded over and over for decades. It still exists today, and like any bureaucratic government structure with continuous funding, it has Canadian sectors locked in place, completely reliant on Washington. We have the early warning systems, radars, command centers that run defense policy in Ottawa, but they are contingent on what Washington deems necessary. And George Grant saw this military integration as part of a larger homogenization politically, culturally, and economically. And if you fast forward to 2026, for the most part, until the last year, he was correct when it came to economics and politics. There's been, of course, erosion of culture, but due to the drastic measures and changes Pierre Trudeau made, it's difficult to assess how prophetic George Grant was, because without taking into account the Trudeau changes, things would be incredibly different in modernity. And this points to the discussion today where the liberals are framing this same argument against America with a complete blind spot to China and the global New World Order. But I'd like to postulate a question for you. What do you think the other options would be? If the budget was there and the social programs, the government bloat were slashed in like a Javier Milei type chainsaw hypothetical, tax rates were lowered. I agree the correct move would be to create a strong military. For me, for example, creating conditions for the youth like that we see in South Korea with mandatory service, I think would help create a responsible, fit populace of critical thinkers, if nothing else. But if the technology is, even if we were to do that, and the technology is supplied by Lockheed, Northrop Grumman, and it's all American IP, what would be the cost to innovate and have everything Canadian? And is this even possible from a technical standpoint? I don't think so. The laissez-faire attitude from academia for our domestic population and the degradation of morality, responsibility has had catastrophic effects on the capabilities we have domestically. And there's the immigrant situation where our society is not cohesive, and times are different than they were in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, where the immigration program was for skilled engineers, doctors, and high IQ exports. So what do you think of that? If this is kind of brings back up the paradox of what we just spoke about, but I think it's really apparent when it comes to NORAD and the security of the continent.
Sorry, I had to cough. Well, I okay. I think it's one of those things you have to break down into chunks. Part of the problem that we had originally, why our defense spending has been so low, and we've been accused of that since the 1950s, is especially post Soviet collapse. Without there being a real threat over the Arctic Circle for the longest time, it allowed us to become complacent. In fact, I think all of Europe became complacent. That's one of the reasons why we're having to do catch up now. The other problem, of course, we have to look at and recognize really, and I don't know if our military leaders are doing this or not, is understanding how the battlegrounds have changed. We're now in a fourth generation warfare, which is where you have non-state actors that are involved in terrorist organizations, insurgent groups, rather than regular military tactics, right? So you've got guerrilla tactics and psychological operations. So it's asymmetric warfare that we're talking about, cybersecurity, online. It is very different than say it was. I'm not saying, of course, there wasn't or there isn't need for actual materiel and a military proper as well. But we need to make sure that we're innovating and staying on top of the changes that have actually taken place because you don't want to be fighting the last war. And the last war was quite some time ago. But again, I mean, we've always historically lagged in military investment. Back in the 1950s, around the Korean War, our spending as part of GDP was around about 7%. In fact, that's the highest that it was. And that's around about the same time that the Avro Arrow program was running as well. Um, and we'll get into that in a couple of minutes here, but when it comes to military spending, in some ways, our government has always treated it like a political football. So, for instance, we've had Canada class nuclear submarines that were proposed back in 1958 to 89, roughly. There were recommendations. They never, for 10 nuclear powered attack submarines with an option for two more, that got canceled. Um, there's currently our current fleet actually is 4 submarines, and they're diesel electric, so and I'm not entirely sure if all of them are in the water right now or if some of them are in dry dock for service. But there are plans to apparently have up to 12 new submarines. They're from a German Norwegian consortium. And when you talk about acquisition, of course, and that includes also operations, it means upgrades, equipment maintenance, and so on. You're probably looking at about $100 billion, and that might just be the start. So, for a country that's got 40 million people, it is a lot of an expenditure to make. But I mean, again, as you pointed out, there has to be trade offs, right? Same thing again with other things that turn into political footballs in the budget is used as an excuse, so like the maritime helicopters. Brian Mulroney signed a deal for $4.4 billion to replace our old Sea Kings. The Liberals got in 1993, campaigning against excessive Tory spending, and then they canceled the helicopters in 1993. It was one of the first acts that they did in order to uh, carry out deficit reduction. So we wound up having Sea Kings in service significantly longer than we should have, right? And today, of course, we have upset with the United States. It's fractured trade relations. So now we have people saying, well, we shouldn't be getting the F-35, despite the fact, of course, we've got a contract to buy them. They're now saying we should go with the Saab interceptor jet instead. So this is where, between geopolitics and the need to be responsible for Canadian taxpayers' dollars, plus national interest, it does make for quite the challenge. And it doesn't seem to matter whether it's liberal or conservative government. I know that Grant likes to come down pretty hard on the liberals, but quite frankly, both need to take their responsibility for military spending seriously.
Yeah, I think. I mean, that we saw this with in the states with Biden, the appointees for the military there, you get into huge problems when your political ideology and your convictions are structured in a way that supersede the basic needs of the military. And I think, especially when it comes to the SAB deal, it seems like it's just posturing and virtue signaling to get away from America due to the baseline, aversion to Trump. And I think that's anytime you put the politics over such basic thing needs like how to structure the military, we're going to be in massive problems.
Well, what I found when I go through a lot of this historical material, textbooks, and so on, is the threat. We have a consistent thread of a historical perceived threat of takeover of the United States of Canada. And that's how we got talked into Confederation. That was actually a concern before we even formed into Confederation as well. There was an article of annexation that was put out in the late 1840s, I believe it was. So it's an ongoing thing that keeps coming back. Grant mentions this in his book again, more in the frame of continentalism, which is to say the economic integration rather than an actual military exercise over the borders. But again, today with Trump, I did think it was kind of interesting that um, one of the things that first came up was the the Americans are going to cross the border. And it's like, well, no, but if this was always a concern, why have we kept our military spending low? Right? If this is something uh, I I do see, that's the irony. I don't know if necessarily irony is necessarily the word to use, maybe perhaps paradox. We use the Americans as a threat to our national sovereignty when it's politically convenient, but we don't actually do the exercises or what's necessary for certain aspects in order to mitigate that either. Which I think is kind of funny. That must be a uniquely Canadian thing. Do you
Yeah, I
think?
mean it's completely paradoxical, and especially when we're talking about NORAD. To this day, the U.S. essentially has the final say for anything when it comes to that. So we are, whether we want to believe it or not, if there is World War III down the pipeline, Russia with Russia or with China, we are 100% dependent, and not only are we dependent, the infrastructure is already there that we are reliant on in our own country. So the posturing when it comes to the anti-Americanism, it's funny because there is a parallel to, but there's a parallel to what George Grant says, and how Diefenbaker's concern of imperialism and wanting national sovereignty. But in our present day, that's completely not the case at all. When it comes to the liberals, it's completely ideological, and they're just more than happy to run into the arms of the Chinese or whatever this new world order globalism um, cult that we see with the leaders in the EU.
Well, exactly. We've seen a lot actually in the news recently about the collapse of the uh, existing. How do they put that? Oh, I'm drawing a blank. The existing law and order, effectively, of international law. So, rules based order. That's it. Um, and the thing is, it was always in some ways doomed to fail, anyways, because whenever you have large countries that have large economies that don't have to they're not limited in the ways, say, smaller economies like Canada are. We just don't have the economic weight or clout to be able to say, "You know what? I'm not paying attention to that rule." The United States, China, and Russia don't have to go to the international courts to try and get things sorted out, for instance, right? They're large enough they can say, "Yeah, I'm not paying attention to that." But it also means that now, for me at least anyways, when I look at issues of national defense, continentalism makes sense economically and actually from a defense perspective as well, because you're looking at a contained area. And I don't know, considering how the attempts at global initiatives, because before you had the United Nations, you had the League of Nations. It was the same thing. Eventually, it collapsed because there's not an ability to enforce, because the larger powers don't have to play along. And that was the case both times, actually, with the League of Nations and now today with the United Nations. So it is always, I suspect, going to be a case of the might makes right. And it just depends on how well the mighty want to be cooperative, and whether or not you're going to have a um, quiet and calm existence where trade can flourish, or if you're looking at something perhaps a little bit more exciting. And I don't mean that in a nice way.
Yeah, I think that's right. The continentalism makes sense, especially even in Europe. That's why it makes sense for them over there, but it's absurd to try to posture that it's better for Canada to be reloaded from military, especially through the military over there, than as opposed to with America. Like it's completely disconnected based on the ideology now.
Well, exactly. And, there we've got competing economic interests as well going on here. Mark Carney, of course, has said that he wants to make Canada a energy superpower as far as green energy goes. And of course, you don't have to look very far. Just go over to Germany, see how well that goes. But this is where, in some way, it's adjacent, but it follows along the same lines, where the government decides we want to tackle this thing that'll make us number one in the world, and they can't follow through. Like, that was the case with the Avro Arrow program, actually. And as much as I love seeing the Saab jet interceptor that people keep putting into Canadian livery and calling it Arrow 2, it's nowhere near as beautiful as the original one that was built way back when. And at the time, we're talking about the Cold War is just getting started. There's a lot of concern about Soviet interceptors coming and dropping nukes, because that's, of course, how the original 2 that were launched in warfare were deployed, was through Enola Gay, and I can't remember the name of the other plane that dropped Fat Man and Little Boy on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that was the concern at the time, that Russia was going to come, drop nukes. We needed interceptors to prevent that from happening. So in 1954, the Royal Canadian Air Force put out a tender for next generation supersonic interceptor jets, so that we could have a way to kind of mitigate that. And we had 2 companies at the time that were competing for contracts. We had Avro Canada, which was, of course, part British, and then there was Canadair. And it just so happened that Avro had the far more, how should I put it, innovative design for that. So the Liberal government under Louis Saint Laurent provided the initial funding for it, because it was viewed as a national security issue, and it would also help with industrial growth as well. The unfortunate thing, of course, is on the day that the Avro Arrow is rolled out and debuted, just happens to be the same day that Sputnik launched on October 4th, 1957. Now, I mean, as I talk about an unfortunate coincidence, but Sputnik didn't come from out of nowhere. What people, I think, don't know, or perhaps because of the Cold War, I know that I was told as a kid Sputnik came out, and that's it, all worried about intercontinental ballistic missiles. But really, back in 1952, the International Council of Scientific Unions um, knew that solar activity would be at a high point in between 1957 and 58. So they're wanting to create artificial satellites to be launched in order to map the Earth's surface. And yeah, there was a reason behind the the initial drive to get the first satellite into space. But the fallout from that, of course, is that immediately we've got this concern now that, well, if the Russians can go and put a satellite into space, that means they can send nukes over on rockets, and we don't need expensive aircraft. And unfortunately, that was bad for Avro. As innovative as their plane was, it was also incredibly expensive as well. And I know there's a lot of talk that they were. I keep seeing the rumors that they were told, well, we don't need interceptors anymore. I think it really came down to more a matter of we have a program that's run in excess of almost $1 billion at that point in time, and we're talking 1950, what is it, 58, thereabouts. So we're we're not a big country now, but that was a lot of money, a serious amount of money way back then. So in some ways, I can't blame the government for making that decision, although it's been haunting us ever since. I mean, everybody recognizes that as like a missed opportunity. But the United States got to be the beneficiary of that. I mean, the brain drain after the Avro program was shut down. So many of our scientists went on to work at NASA. They worked on the Mercury program, the Gemini program, Apollo programs, and even, I suspect, although I can't be sure, no one can confirm this, a lot of the materials that were used in the Avro Arrow were involved things like titanium, not to the same extent as perhaps you would see on the SR-71 Blackbird that Lockheed Martin and Skunk Works put together, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if some of our Avro people actually went to work at Skunk Works, just because they had been on the Arrow program. So that's a little bit of history thrown in there for people, but you know, yeah, the joke at the time was the best thing that happened to America was that the cancellation of the Arrow. Unfortunately, what a dark bit of humor that is. But I mean, sorry, let's get on to Beaumark because the missiles, that's ultimately what they canceled the Arrow for. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that program there,
Yeah.
Mark?
Well, I'll just touch one thing on what you said. How it was the good thing for America. It's really true because especially with the way that the government forced the destruction of all of the Arrow, and if you look into the motivations of that, it's there's ties there that you could point to saying that it's America that didn't want competition for any of that technology. So yeah, it really is a shame. Um, but it does there. The logic is there when it comes to using needing to confront the threat of interballistic missiles, which is where we get into the Beaumark. The Beaumark missiles were the world's first long-range surface-to-air missiles, developed in the 50s as a crucial component of the North American air defense, specifically against potential Soviet bombers during the Cold War. If things were to turn hot, this is what they were worried about. And these missiles were 45 feet long with wings that were about 18 feet wide. They weighed 18,000 pounds and had a 400-mile range at speeds of up to Mach 3. And to be effective against the perceived Soviet bomber threat, they had to be tipped with a 7 to 10 kiloton nuclear W-40 warhead. And the idea there was that with a nuclear blast, they could destroy multiple targets in bomber formations with a large atmospheric explosion near the targets as opposed to precision strikes. Um, I think part of that was because to do with we only had 56 of them, but they were stored in two places: the RCAF station North Bay, Ontario, and the RCAF station La Macase, Quebec. They were sheltered in buildings that had these movable roofs, and then when the roofs were removed, it would erect the missiles vertically, and they'd be ready for launch. Now, the big problem that everyone had with these was obviously the fact that they were tipped with nuclear warheads. And this was due to the design. As I said, they were designed to explode in the air, kind of acting like birdshot, so one missile could affect a squadron of bombers. Now, the problem with this is, well, there was actually a few, but the biggest one was that the missiles had to be controlled by the SAGE radar system, which was a complex ground radar network that was built to track the missiles' targets and guide them where they needed to go. And these radar commands would get the missiles to a close enough range, and then an onboard radar within the missile would activate for the final homing stage towards the target. Now, the problem with this system was it didn't really work. This has come out in declassified papers, even at the time when they were working on it. With they spent billions on this thing, and the problem they were having is they couldn't make it not susceptible to radar jamming. And if you look at the timelines, there's actually evidence that JFK actually knew this and pushed the technology on Canada anyways. Because the missile systems needed this guidance to work, if the network were to be jammed, essentially the missiles would fall out of the sky, and then there was an emergency detonation that would have to be activated to make sure that the nuclear warheads didn't go off or were compromised. But this would still cause an explosion that would, make radioactive material rain down to the surface. So this is a huge problem, and it really was kind of a big bluff that the military was doing during the Cold War when it came to our defense. The missile system was operational, yeah, and it worked, but it had this huge liability and weak spot when it came to being jammed. And that problem of this system was known, but the assumption was from the Americans that if they just kept throwing money at the problem, then the radar mapping in the missile system would be fixed. And they ended up dumping about 8 to 12 billion into it. And to put that into perspective, that's almost 4 times what the cost was for the Manhattan Project. So after decades of having this secret of being vulnerable to radar jamming, it was also ineffective to low-flying planes. There was a few other issues, and then also the innovation of the transistors. Eventually, this whole program was scrapped. Now, what was interesting about all of this and how it tied into Canada and Diefenbaker, with the project having these massive problems, but yet the program was still pushed forward, really shows at the highest levels from the American side, it was acceptable to put all the initial risk on Canada. In a war scenario, hitting a Soviet bomber squadron, if the missiles were successful, there would be large clouds of radiation above southern Ontario and Quebec that would obviously be on above the population zones. And if the missiles were jammed and had to be emergency detonated, there'd be literal chunks of radioactive material that would be raining down on Canadian soil. Also, by placing the Beaumark missiles at the base in North Bay and La Macasa, now those two areas would possibly make Canada the first country to be attacked in a permanent first strike if the war actually popped off. So I think we can look at this as the whole program was designed as the first means of defense, but with the interests of America first, and for Canada to become the fall guy. And while having these missiles in Canada, the final say for launch was also still controlled by America. Diefenbaker tried to make it so that Canada would have ultimate control. And this is one of the contention points that he had with JFK, but this was ultimately rejected. And then after he left, and eventually when Lester Pearson became prime minister, complete control over the system was then conceded to the United States. So I think this is an example that of Diefenbaker's vindication on how he was skeptical of how pushy America was in America's interests. And Grant was also correct assessing that the nuclear agreements were really a Faustian bargain.
Well, I find it hard to disagree with that. It does come across as I go through some of these documents that the liberals are more interested in ingratiating themselves with the United States. So while Diefenbaker was saying no thanks to the warheads, the liberals did, yeah, decide to go ahead. But that what uh, I find it, how do I put it? Uh, a parallel with what we're seeing today was that uh, the Beaumark missiles at the time that before they actually the liberals had gotten into power and said, "Well, we'll take everything." And while Diefenbaker was, quote, as they called it, indecisive on the issue, there was a student movement actually that started up to protest against it. Uh, let's have a quick look here. Yeah. Students marched on Parliament Hill. It was on Christmas Day, 1959, where students marched on Parliament Hill for the first time since the end of the Second World War. They were members of 3 university chapters. created the Combined Universities Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. And so, I mean, this is long before the student protests back in the mid-60s, so you're talking anti-Vietnam War, civil rights, and, to a lesser degree, nukes. I mean, this is way ahead of that. This is back in the, early 1960s. But there was apparently, yeah, a spirit of public action, a willingness to test limits. The students were quite energized over this, but there was also, in some ways, it showed a democratization of the foreign policy where the public wanted to have more of a say. And when it comes to nuclear war, let's face it, that was for them recent history, right? It wasn't that far from all the news reports of what had happened and how the war had wrapped up in Japan, basically. So to them, seeing, I would assume, the devastation, they said, "No, thank you. We absolutely don't want any of our people to be affected in that way." So I can, in some ways, I kind of understand it. What I find interesting, however, though, is recently nukes have come back up into the discussion again. I was watching a trigonometry episode the other day, actually, where they were talking with Eric Weinstein about Donald Trump wanting to restart nuclear testing, and he was saying that in some ways it would be beneficial because there's been so much time now between when they were last used that we almost need a reminder to remember exactly how much power these things have and how dangerous they are. Of course, as part of the nuclear non-proliferation agreements, and there were, of course, bans on nuclear testing that were signed as well decades ago. The chances of actually being able to get that done, I think, are somewhere between slim and none at best. But I don't know. Do we need to have a fear factor put in again, right? Just to kind of remind ourselves why we ought not to be using these things?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I think it's good. When we look at the period in the '60s, when these protests were going on, the notion there was the 1961 Parliament Hill rally, and then 1964 La Casa Vigil, and those were really based on this, anti-imperialist rhetoric, and the demonstrations. They partnered with pacifist organizations to assert that hosting U.S. warheads compromised Canada's moral and political independence. And Grant breaks this down as the nation kind of breaking down and succumbing to American power. But my take is a little bit different on this. I have a few thoughts, and I'm not sure that the nuclear proliferation or this type of pacifism is optimal to begin with. From my worldview, I would rather much Canada had a stronger military and had the bomb as a military power, because this would create the conditions for other countries to be more weary and not be so willing to undermine us to the extent that they do, specifically China and India. Neither of these countries treat us with the respect of a nuclear superpower. And looking at these protests from the lens of today, the parallel's there, but it's still different. The national pride of the nation is broken down, so we don't see the demonstrations really for the sovereignty of our nation much at all. We see massive ones for Palestine. The Iranian one that we just saw was massive. I think the biggest we've ever had. Then obviously there's been ones for Ukraine and for native reconciliation, literally everything but mobilization for the protection and love for our own heritage, if you exclude the trucker protests. And I think this speaks to more the nature of the organizers. There was these pacifist organizations back then, and now these same groups have become more radical, and so have the liberal attitudes when it comes to these demonstrations. From the Marxist lens, victimhood is used as a weapon, and no matter the circumstance, it's easy to paint an enemy as an oppressor when you hold that view. And from this progressive Marxist lens, whether valid or contrived, to achieve maximal effectiveness, protests are, organized to try to appeal and pull on the heartstrings of people from emotional arguments to then be able to mobilize them to achieve power. Not necessarily outwardly do they do this, but they're definitely structured that way when you're analyzing the levers of power. So I don't see the landscape today as as simple or even comparable to anything that there was in the 60s, because the values and influences within our own government are so different and antithetical to our national interests. And whatever national spirit George Grant hoped to save back then, that was, he saw pride in those pacifist movements. I think all any hope that was there has been swiftly gutted by Pierre Trudeau, and we live in a darker time.
Well, certainly a more complex one. I will say in Trump and Weinstein's favor, on this point alone, when you instead of seeing old footage, perhaps of others like Castle Bravo or Tsar Bomba or any other nuclear weapon testing that had happened, having something more recent. And let's not forget, as well, from a scientific standpoint, the instruments that we have today are far more advanced, far more sensitive. They could wind up collecting a lot more data from that by doing a test, as well as a visual reminder of this is why you don't want to play with these particular kinds of toys. But uh, so if they were going to do it from that standpoint, I suppose it would make sense to me as a show of strength. If one was trying to position it as a show of strength, I think it's stupid. It's not particularly smart because it the the ability of infiltration, and we see this in Canada as well. We do have problems with bad state actors finding ways into influence here, and we're struggling to deal with that. I think that's far more of a threat considering we have, as I outlined earlier, asymmetrical warfare, the opportunities for undermining, say, perhaps infrastructure, certainly through cyber means, so cyber warfare. And that's not including propaganda and using things like bot armies to influence and sway public opinion, which is largely something that we do have to take into account because the government, of course, cannot do anything without consent from the people. So if you have a bad state actor that's using a bot army to push a certain message to nudge the people in a certain way, that can either help or harm Canada's position because the government, of course, works by polls, and they will be looking at that as saying, "Well, this is the direction we need to go in," which may not necessarily be correct. But I don't know. I mean, from a scientific standpoint, I mean, I suppose it makes sense, but am I just a little off the mark here, right? Or what do you think?
Um, well, I would just say that I, from my view, any type of nuclear testing will be seen as a sign of force, and then therefore the decision is made to affirm that. Um, regardless of the testing argument or not. If once they decide to do that, it's going to have reverberations, showing the sign of force. And I think, especially with how excited you can imagine how excited engineers would be to get to work on a project like that. It is kind of a victory dance when they do their test. So I think those things. I don't really think you can separate those two things. I think they come as a package deal.
So what you're saying is we'd start having an inadvertent bandwagon effect where it's like, okay, well, someone's testing one. Well, we've got to do a test of our own just to see if it, confirms with the experiment, so to speak. And next thing you know, everybody's got one and got to go and try it just because it's
Yeah,
exciting.
yeah. I think pretty much. I would agree with that to some extent. I don't know how often this would be, but I don't think it would be as continuous and as like how they're structured in North Korea, for example, with bringing all the people up and lining them up to have some great festival showing it. But I think, yeah, I think it would create a chain of everybody arming up, and I think that's the inevitable. If the conflicts in China, Taiwan, in Russia, Ukraine, in Israel and Iran, I think as those escalate, I think these are things to look for because I think they are inevitable because they will have to test, to be prepared for the worst case scenario regardless. So I think this is more of just the reality than yeah. I think it's the reality.
Yeah, fair enough. I do actually wonder I do stop and wonder when people who are as smart as Eric Weinstein do put out these kind of ideas. What exactly are we aiming for? Um, I think he does actually absolutely have a point when it comes to where we should be concentrating, which is to say, and he was very good about this actually, that we need to be concentrating on conquering the issue of interstellar travel in order to ensure the survival of the human species. And so far, nobody seems to be interested in that, aside from perhaps Elon Musk. But overall, generally speaking, we we haven't got the pioneer and exploratory fire going off just yet. And perhaps that might be more productive rather than trying to blow things up just to see if they still work, I guess. But, I mean, okay, so let's get back to for a little bit because the friction between Carney actually Carney and Trump not so bad. Certainly Justin Trudeau and Trump was something else. We've seen this kind of friction before between prime ministers and American presidents, haven't we?
Yeah, I think going into Diefenbaker, it's really interesting, especially if we go back to that time. The interesting thing about Diefenbaker was that he was pretty close to President Eisenhower. They got along somewhat ideologically. There's reports they went fishing together. Relations were pretty cordial. But with Kennedy, however, they did not get along. In fact, they actually despised each other. There was only one time that JFK came to Canada. The meeting was brief, and speaking to the press on the way out, he didn't even get his name right, calling him Prime Minister Diefenbaker. And some people say that was intentional. In '61, Diefenbaker then went to America to meet JFK in the White House, and it was reported in the press that JFK thought that Diefenbaker was boring, and Kennedy told his brother that he never wanted to see that son of a bitch again. So they'd go back and forth, and Diefenbaker would go on to have his own slights at Kennedy that got quoted with him saying, "He's a hothead, too young, too brash, too inexperienced, and a boastful son of a bitch." Now, personally, I found this quote of Diefenbaker's incredibly interesting because, of course, JFK in the public consciousness is loved. He has a great legacy. He's a do no wrong type of figure, especially because of how he was tragically killed. But consistently from historians, there's a theme that he didn't handle confrontation well when people wouldn't do the things he wanted for America. Now, this is the main theme of him butting heads with Diefenbaker in George Grant's Lament for a Nation. But with hindsight, I think we can flush things out for a better picture there. Now, for years, anything other than the initial narrative when it came to the whole JFK assassination was always hand waved away as conspiracy theory, even up until recently. But with the release of the JFK files in 2025, it was confirmed that not only the CIA, but also Israel intelligence had their fingerprints all over the event the day of the assassination, which, for many who didn't believe the official narrative over the last half century, confirmed their speculations. Now, there are interesting theories diving into whether it was the issues with the CIA. JFK had explicitly stated that he wanted to split up the CIA based on his belief that they had overreached when it came to foreign policy, as well as the scandal of the Bay of Pigs. And JFK had the same type of contentious relationship he had with Diefenbaker with the director of the CIA, Alan Dulles. There's also theories that he had double crossed the mob that also tie into the CIA, and speculations aroused that that was what had got him killed. There was this notion that he was too soft when it came to communism with Vietnam, and then he mishandling the situation in Cuba. And then there's also the fact that Israel had stolen hundreds of kilograms of nuclear material suitable for weapons from America and smuggled them to Tel Aviv in the 50s in what was called the Numek affair. JFK was made aware of Israel's secretive nuclear program in '61 from spy footage of the Dimona reactor and was deeply concerned about it potentially leading to nuclear weapons development. And there were tons of documented conversations back and forth with then Prime Minister of Israel, Ben Gurion. Some of them, he's actually yelling on the phone, yelling epithets at the Prime Minister over delays when it came to U.S. nuclear inspections. Now, this was a relationship that was hostile for JFK, just like the one with Diefenbaker, just like Alan Dulles. And he also had similar spats with Nikita Khrushchev. the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, which obviously spun out of control with the Cuban Missile Crisis, escalations at the Berlin Wall, and take whatever he says with a grain of salt, obviously. But Khrushchev thought his thoughts on JFK were that he was also hot-headed and inexperienced. Um, Also, Charles de Gaulle, the Prime Minister of France, had similar clashes with JFK over the similar issues that Diefenbaker had. Again, butting heads over nationalism. De Gaulle wanted France to have its own nuclear weapons, rejecting JFK's multilateral force proposal, which eventually caused France to withdraw from NATO's military command structure. So I say all of that to say, regardless of which theory into why JFK was assassinated you find compelling, what Diefenbaker said about him was a perspective I had never heard, and there seems to be some evidence around it that it was a measured assessment of him, being too hot headed and naive. And maybe this stubbornness is what got him in a position that eventually got him murdered. Now, these same type of hostile confrontations continued with Diefenbaker throughout the Canada-U.S. relations. There was conflict with JFK over Canada's relationship to Cuba. Cuba had a strong banking interests, or Canada had strong banking interests there before Castro took over in '59. So our relationship was obviously much different from America's. And of course, JFK wasn't pleased with Canada continuing trade with Cuba, and put pressure on us, and ended up having Canada had to take out the majority of the banks that were there. And to this point, I found it interesting that Diefenbaker was the one who actually allowed the relationship with Cuba to continue after Castro got in '59, just adding fuel to the fire, pointing to this feud that they had back and forth, taking little jabs at each other. This was the first of many policy disagreements that compounded on the personal contempt that they had. And going into these scenarios, it really outlines how Diefenbaker stayed true to his values, how he hated the elite, and then this also reaffirms that Kennedy didn't really like people who disagreed with him. So the whole story of the Canada-U.S. relations of this decade is this dance they do between each other. It's similar to the leaders that I mentioned earlier, with Ben Gurion standing out, the documentation of them yelling on the phone. Um, Diefenbaker in Canada had a consistent position when it came to Vietnam, also just to stay observant and not get involved. This added conflict with JFK over Vietnam as Canada was added to the ICC Commission, which was the oversight board Canada held alongside India and Poland for diplomatic observance of the conflict. And because of this, Diefenbaker was actually able to reject JFK's calls for Canadian troops to be sent to Vietnam to help the war effort, because there would be a conflict of interest there due to being part of the ICC. So during I think it was February 1961, there was a meeting in Washington and subsequent Ottawa summit in May, where Kennedy pressed Diefenbaker more for direct troop commitments or foreign aid, more help in Vietnam. But Diefenbaker stood firm, rejected these demands, not only due to the conflict of interest, but staying consistent to his worldview, seeing engagement in the war as being an extension of the U.S. imperialism and a threat to the Canadian sovereignty. That was the position that he held throughout his whole tenure. So the Vietnam disagreement intertwined with other issues. Deacon Baker's refusal to accept U.S.-controlled nuclear warheads for the Bomark anti-aircraft missiles that we just spoke about, and also for NATO-assigned troops in Europe, prioritizing Canadian sovereignty over what he saw as potential U.S. unilateral control and radioactive fallout risks on Canadian soil. And now we can fast forward to 1957. Lester Pearson had won the Nobel Peace Prize for his key role in resolving the Suez Crisis. He proposed and helped establish the first UN peacekeeping force. There's another angle to that story also, where he was actually helping the Americans with this, and that's why he got the prize to begin with, but that's another rabbit hole for a different discussion. But this became a huge story because in April 1962, during Diefenbaker's term, JFK invited Pearson, the only non-American among 49 Nobel laureates, to a high-profile White House dinner where they honored the winners. JFK then met privately with Pearson for about 20 minutes and then singled him out positively in the remarks he gave to the press. And this was seen as a deliberate snub to Diefenbaker, who later complained about it to the U.S. ambassador. And, it was a real boost to Pearson's prestige amid these tensions. And by encouraging Pearson politically by highlighting his Nobel status, this is just another example of an underhanded dig at Diefenbaker, with JFK aligning against him. And what was interesting about this is, that it finally comes to a conclusion because in 1963, Kennedy actually starts getting briefings and tries to start undermining Diefenbaker in the retaining of the office of Prime Minister. Up until the Canadian election, JFK's administration intervened in Canadian politics with polling advice, media leaks against Diefenbaker, and spinning the pressure on nuclear policy to try to influence the Canadian public, doing everything that he could to contribute to Diefenbaker's defeat. And then, sure enough, Lester Pearson wins the election in 63, and Pearson immediately flipped his party's stance on accepting U.S. nuclear warheads shortly after, instantly capitulating to the hard work for years Diefenbaker had made to, standing on the strong principles he did.
Yeah, that's not surprising. Okay, let's look at this in a more macro sense because up until Diefenbaker's government took control back in 1957, uh, the Liberals actually had been in power almost 22 years from 1935 until 1957. Of course, in 56, they pushed the pipeline issue, rammed it through, and that's why they lost government. So, perhaps, do you think that the Kennedy government or the executive, let's put it that way, overall was looking at it as well? These guys are here for a short time. Uh, a 20-year plus run of the Liberal Party tells us that these are the people who fit most comfortably in. So therefore, we're just going to make forays into establishing a relationship because they will have to come back eventually. Do you think maybe perhaps that might have been some of what was going on? Just some, rather than necessarily trying to undermine. It helps, of course, if you do undermine the people you don't like, but if there was perhaps some of that going on as well, that they just simply recognize that these people, long term Canadians, must select them for a reason, and therefore that's who we gotta get in. Uh, some opportunism perhaps on the Liberals' part as well. What do you think?
I think you could probably look at it, as bad as this is to say, as the American scene, these concerns or nationalistic pride is being largely performative. um, because eventually, with the way the continental stuff is structured, we're completely reliant anyway. So, I think it was virtuous what Diefenbaker did, especially when it came to those plans, and especially when you look back and you see how the Bullmark, these things, they could be jammed, they could fall out of the sky, radiation could go everywhere. There's, with the hindsight being 2020, it's easy to see that for this round, the virtues of the nationalists, played well. But when it comes to the practical aspect that we started off talking about in the space, this is kind of the misalignment that we just see in politics in general, where there's the concerns and the alignment of the power structures and the financial structures, and then there's the kind of ethereal um, political aspirations that try to get woven in, um, and kind of, and weave back and forth. And I think yeah, I think America, for the most part, especially at that time, just saw us as normally someone that was easy to play ball with, and occasionally someone would come up that would be a little more difficult. But at the end of the day, it didn't really matter what we thought, because they had all the power.
Well, fair enough. And there was, I mean, one of the things that Grant talks about continual in his book, of course, is the branch plant economy, which is to say you have a lot of interest and investment from Americans into corporations that happen to be here in Canada. And to some degree, that's because there just isn't an ability to get the capital needed for some of these things. So that makes sense, I suppose, in a way that you just simply go and find whoever is willing to invest. And if it happens to be on their side of the border, okay, well, it is what it is. So there's probably a degree of that. I do know that Grant does mention in his book many times over about the commercial interests that the Liberal Party has and how closely knit that is with big business in the background. You don't see it very much, but he does make a point of highlighting that as well. So, you know, uh, I suppose from that standpoint, it is to be expected. Short conservatives for the short term, just to show off. Okay, we've been properly chastened, and in fact, they did mention that. Uh, but long term, they're going to go with whatever's going to work for them economically, as well as policy wise. And I, when Mark Carney, and that was actually surprising at the time too. If you recall, before the election got going last year, Trump effectively sort of endorsed Carney anyways. Well, I can deal with a liberal better than I can deal with a conservative. So that can't be for no reason. They're not necessarily going to be outwards saying what's going on, but we are, of course, familiar with all of the business dealings that Mark Carney does have set up with Brookfield and the various satellite companies that are adjacent to that. So there is some of that as well. It seems to be ever present, which I suppose in our next episode we can, or maybe even explore that a little bit now. Does our government work for us at all, or is it just for their interests? What do you reckon?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think that's really illuminating, especially going through this text that why would Trump do what he did? That to basically he didn't outwardly endorse Carney, but it was obvious that he's pretty tactical with how he releases how he agitates the media, let's say, and it definitely wasn't in the interests of the conservative. And I think that does speak to it's probably just easier for them to deal with our liberal governments. And then I would say on the onus that for the liberal status quo, um, the most important thing is growing the markets, financial. Um, and when there's no, there isn't this dogmatic attachment to things that supersede just making money, then obviously that the liberals become a better, an easier choice for them to deal with. Um, yeah.
Yeah, no, it makes sense actually in a lot of ways. I did actually run across a document the other day. We're going to go over some more of that next week, but it does outline how Canada differed at its foundation when it came to industrialization. And I think a lot of that plays into Diefenbaker's view of nationalism, which is to say, small town, very agrarian. And what this paper that I came across just the other day mentioned was that there wasn't really a lot of opportunities for farmers to have influence that you would find in other economies around the world before they went through industrialization, but it is a little bit more technical to get into, so I don't wanna do that necessarily too much today, but I'm just gonna kinda throw that out there, and, I don't know, Nuck, what do you think? Do you wanna open this up to the floor? Do you wanna field questions from people, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, whatever you want to do.
Okay, well, let me just have a quick little look here and see. I, am having some issues with spaces on my phone, apparently. Not sure what's going on with this. Let me see. Nope, for whatever reason, we may not be able to bring people up. That would suck. Yeah, I have exactly one button available to me, and that's mute everyone. Well, I don't wanna do that. So, I mean, it seemed we seem to be having this around about this time because it was around about, 1 hour and 20 or 5 minutes in or so thereabouts last week. Your phone was having issues. Um,
It's a conspiracy.
it must be. I know. Well, we don't want Canadians to know about all the things that has happened before, and we're in a Groundhog Day loop. Okay. Well, okay, let me ask you, do you think we've gone over the material well enough, for what we've gone through so far, or is there something we haven't addressed yet that we should while we have some time to do it?
Well, I think well for me, I can speak for myself. What I found most interesting was examining the Kennedy angle, and really how I had no idea that he had these so many confrontations with other world leaders, and kind of examining this conflict between his more liberal attitude compared to Diefenbaker, and then how, if we zoom out, how the discussion that we just had, how that actually a conservative might actually be harder to deal with for Americans when it comes to getting things done quickly. I just think that whole just seeing that different angle of things was pretty illuminating and pretty interesting.
Well, we're so familiar with the political personalities that we deal with or see on TV all the time, and especially through the internet and social media. Um, it's when we look back at these things that happened way before, certainly it's way before my time. I wasn't around when all of these events went on. I mean, despite the gray hair, I'm not really not that old. But I do find some things, never change. We are talking about, yes, they're leaders of nations. They're also still human beings, so they are guaranteed to have feet of clay. But I did find it uh, something to be mindful of, anyways, because I came across writings from Knowlton Nash, of course, who was a journalist here, and he was on CBC and wrote for various magazines and so on here in Canada. He'd written a book called Kennedy and Diefenbaker: Fear and Loathing Across the Undefended Border. And as you have noticed, of course, he was along the same lines. He was highlighting how their differing styles and political approaches led to tensions that affected Canada US relations. And in fact, he repeatedly returns to a couple of standard stock things, which is that Diefenbaker is the prairie populist, anti-establishment outsider who rose from humble roots in Saskatchewan, and that Kennedy is the wealthy Harvard-educated Boston patrician from a powerful political dynasty. So, in other words, he's using their actual backgrounds as a way to create stereotypes of them, and in how they carry out all of their international affairs, relations, diplomacy, and so on. And I find that when we when he highlights things like, for instance, trying to make real good cloth out of incidents that, by saying, okay, well, Diefenbaker invited Kennedy to speak up in Ottawa. Diefenbaker wasn't that great with French, was tried anyways. And Kennedy embarrassed, said, trying to put on false modesty. Well, I will, I'll try and say a few words. Meanwhile, his wife, Jacqueline, is fully bilingual and, of course, had primed him quite well. So he spoke what sounded, I suppose, to Eastern ears better French than Diefenbaker managed to muster. Things like that. Uh, I find there. I mean, I understand that it's almost like a form of gossip, really, and it's amusing. Like these anecdotes, yeah, okay, they can be amusing, but it also, if you're going to take those and use them as being the example or the reason for why there was perhaps strained relations between the United States and Canada at the time, I think that's a false connection that's being made. Um, and I'm also, uh, I try and keep in mind that pro Liberal Party historians usually go after and attack the character of the individual that they don't particularly care for, rather than the factual things that actually happened in a lot of respects. I mean, they'll go after factual as well, but if there's a way to get a dig in at the character, they'll do that too. And I think that actually hurts some of the history in some ways. It puts an unnecessary slant on it. But that's just me.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think I think there was probably maybe a bit of a class thing going on there, but I personally think the conflict when it comes to Diefenbaker and JFK, I think it seemed to be more about personality. JFK seemed pretty loose, and I think that conflict was just two different people types, two personality types, and how they interacted rather than whatever rigid box, predetermined box this journalist tried to put them in.
Yeah, that's probably a reasonable assessment. Well, I cannot seem to get the app to work any better on my phone. I've been struggling for minutes here. We're almost at an hour and a half. I don't really have a lot more in the way of material. I think we've covered a fairly good stretch of ground today. What do you think, Right Wing?
Yeah, I think so. Hopefully, the audience agrees. Yeah, I think it was pretty thorough.
Okay. All right. Well, in that case, I think what we'll do is we'll wrap it up for this evening, and I'm going to go and see what's happening with my phone here. But I appreciate all the work that you do in looking up, not just, of course, what Grant mentions in his book, but going the distance in trying to get a better grounding in some of the adjacent things that were going on at the time, rather than just taking Grant's word for it. So, I mean, this is wonderful. Why it is wonderful talking to you on this topic. But thank you so much, Right Wing, for doing this. Of course, we've got one more episode next week on Sunday, 7 p.m. We're going to go through part three and hopefully tie up the last bits of Lament for a Nation, the defeat of Canadian nationalism. So thank you so much, Right Wing, and we'll call it a night, and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me and doing this project with me. And yeah, it's been great. And hopefully, I learned a lot about digging into all this stuff, and hopefully, it was enjoyable for people listening as well.
Absolutely, I enjoy it too. Rabbit holes everywhere. Anyway, all right. Thank you so much, and we'll see you. We'll see you next week. Good night, everyone.